Hello, my name is Dean Wise. I'm a counselor at the American Geographical Society. We have a very interesting conference at Columbia University, November 17th and 18th. It's the future of food. I'm very pleased to have one of our feature speakers with us today to give us the highlights of his talk, Jamie Arbib. Jamie is one of the founders of a very interesting think tank called RethinkX. It's my favorite think tank because they just don't mess around. When they come up with reports, and they've done one on transportation, one on energy, the future of food, which is obviously our topic here, and climate change. They hit it hard. They come up with a very bold scenario. They look out to the future. In this case, we're looking to 2030, 2040, which is perfect for our program here with AGS. And they support it with really good research and good analysis. So, Jamie, I'd like to give you the chance to give us your thesis. So what is this report? And by the way, I should say, this came out 3 years ago this month, and it's called, the subtitle is Second Domestication of Plants and Animals, Disruption of the Cow, and the Collapse of Industrial Livestock. So as you can see, there's a lot to talk about. And then they, RethinkX came out with another piece that tied this together with some other topics called Rethinking Climate Change last year. So Jamie, jump right into it. Give us any background you like on yourself or Rethink, but really want to know, what are the highlights that we can hear about in November from you on the future of food?
Yeah, well, thanks very much indeed, Dean. So we published that report you mentioned 3 years ago now. And really it's looking at the transformation of the food system driven by new technologies that we have. And what our research shows is that we're really on the cusp of the kind of deepest, most profound transformation of the food system since the Neolithic Revolution, since the first domestication of plants and animals. You know, that was the domestication of the macroorganism, the whole plant and the whole animal. What we're about to see is at the microorganism level, the domestication of the cell and the microorganism. So let me briefly explain what's going on. So there are a number of new technologies that are converging together, biotechnologies and information technologies that are creating entirely new possibilities for how we produce materials and food. So we've learned to harness, for instance, microbes to produce pretty much any complex organic molecule that we choose or design. It's a process called precision fermentation. Essentially, it's precision biology combined with fermentation. And the first molecule we produced this way was human insulin. Right? So you go back to the beginning of the 1980s, and we saw insulin produced from the pancreas of a pig or a cow. It took about 50,000 kilograms, sorry, 50,000 animals to produce a kilogram of pig or cow insulin. Now, obviously, that was a worse product. And we were facing shortages. So we developed a process, precision fermentation, in order to produce human insulin, right? Obviously a much better tolerated product, and one that initially was very high cost, and is now becoming ever more competitive. It's been on this extraordinary cost curve, faster even than Moore's law over the past few decades. And we've seen the cost per kilogram drop from over $1 billion back in the early 80s down well below $100 in producing these kinds of proteins. And that's really what drives disruption, Dean. It's the cost and capability of new technologies and their ability to outcompete existing ones. So when we see new technology—
Jamie, so you're going beyond what many of us are familiar with, which is the plant-based meats, which are now becoming somewhat popular, although not terribly popular, like Impossible meat and so forth. You're talking about a new generation of, I would call it, lab-based proteins, which is your precision fermentation. That's the big technology driver here.
Precision fermentation is one of them. Also cellular agriculture, the ability to start with a single cell and grow meat essentially. So that's the other technology. Both these avenues, can replace existing livestock farming. Absolutely. Disruptions generally are driven by the cost and capability of new technologies, new products and services. When new products and services are cheaper and better than the old, we tend to see a disruption, especially when they're orders of magnitude better, or an order of magnitude better. And that's exactly what we're seeing in this space. You can follow the cost curve, right? These cost curves are kind of like gravity, right? Moore's law has been essentially constant now over, 70 years, arguably over 100 years, actually. And we fully expect these cost curves to continue. So these will get more and more competitive. We've been competitive in the pharmaceutical market, first of all. These products have moved through cosmetics and some materials now, and they're beginning to appear in the food space. And yes, absolutely, Impossible Foods uses one of these products in their burgers. It gives the kind of meaty flavor to the burger, but they still produce the rest of the burger from plants, right? Pea protein, coconut fat, and so on. But as the costs continue to come down, we'd expect them to substitute out the protein and the fats that currently come from plants with these kinds of products. They're not quite competitive enough to do that today. So that's the basis of disruption. But what we see as disruption or adoption of these new products begin to pick up is that these disruptions move very quickly. Right? We've probably heard about the S-curve of technology disruption, the idea that disruption starts slowly and then increase exponentially until they reach market saturation. And then the pace of change begins to slow down. Now, that's what happens in all technology disruptions. And what drives that are essentially a series of feedback loops. And so you get a virtuous cycle of improvement for the new industry. And you get increasing demand, increasing economies of scale, leading to lower cost. You get more investment coming into the space. You often get consumer opinion beginning to change and beginning to support the new, which brings in new government support and so on. So you get a kind of cascade, a virtuous cycle of improvement that drives forward the new technologies. The opposite happens to the old technologies. Right, where you get, reversing economies of scale as demand drops. You get less investment. You get, less consumer approval and support. You get less government support and so on, especially if there are bads associated with that industry. And that can lead to a very quick breakdown of the old industry. In fact, what we expect to see here is that the various different products that come from a cow, for instance, to be disrupted one by one. So really what's happening is we're seeing a transformation of the food system, right? The current system is what we call a breakdown model of production, right? We grow the whole plant or the animal and we break it down into the things we need. So the easiest and most accessible is, say, the steak, the meat, that you literally just carve off the carcass, right? Things like collagen and whey and insulin and so on are much harder to access as single molecules. You have to go through a number of processes to get to them. And that adds cost. So they're the most expensive in terms of processing cost to access. They're byproducts, so it doesn't necessarily figure in the price, but certainly in the cost. The new model turns that on its head. So you start with the single molecule or the single cell, and you build up to more complex products. So the single molecule is the easiest to get to. And the steak, for instance, is the hardest because it requires much more complex structures. And so that's kind of how disruption will unfold, we think. It will start with those single molecules as we're seeing, the whey protein, insulin, the collagen, and so on, and gradually move into kind of minced meat, perhaps, and then up into steaks eventually. But that would be the hardest. But as we replace all these subsidiary products of the cow, the final products, the steak, for instance, will have to bear the whole cost of growing the whole animal. And so we'll see, as we see the new cost declining rapidly, we'll see the new costs rising. So they become increasingly less competitive. And we might see what was an asset like the hide that we could sell for leather, as it gets disrupted itself, become a liability that we have to pay to dispose of. And so that's a feedback loop. There's the increasing cost that drives this rapid transformation. And that's why we think that within about 20 years, we'll see most of the livestock market displaced by these new technologies, and our food will come from an entirely different place.
So Jamie, I'm going to believe you, partly because 6 years ago, RethinkX predicted the scenario that we are now seeing unfolding for electric vehicles. We've also seen the disruption curve in generating costs for solar and wind go way down. So I believe you, and I even believe I'll be finding the lab-based meat or lab-based protein delicious. So what's the knock-on effect, which I think this is where we really have a strong interest in, where you folks have done a great job of saying, what does that mean for land use, for the planet, for human health? Can you describe some of those consequences that we'll experience?
Yeah, so these disruptions to these kind of foundational sectors like food and transport and energy, they tend to have cascading consequences across the rest of the economy and society. So, in terms of environmental issues, I mean, these are profoundly impactful. This is a profoundly impactful disruption because the new technologies are just vastly more efficient, right? So we'll use far less land, we'll use far less water, we'll use far less energy. We'll take all the pressure off the forests, right? There'll be no pressure to deforest anymore, which largely comes about because we want land to grow food for animals. And as we see that happen, it's got hugely beneficial environmental outcomes. And in fact, when we model the disruption of all these sectors and we look at the trajectory in the future for greenhouse gas emissions, we see a huge reduction in the flow of emissions, in the emissions that our economy produces every year. Those three sectors alone, transport, energy, and food, are responsible for about 80% of global emissions. And they'll be largely decarbonized, we think, over the course of the next 2 decades. So that's profound. But actually, what you really do when you see a transformation of livestock farming or a transformation of our food system is you free up huge quantities of land. Right, so currently about 80% of land, of farmland, is used to either feed or as pasture land for animals. We'll no longer need that. And that land can be rewilded, it can be reforested, we can do all kinds of things. So it goes from being essentially a carbon source to a carbon sink. It has profound implications and allows us to begin to deal with that stock of greenhouse gas emissions that we've already admitted, rather than just the flow, rather than just the annual emissions that we produce every year. But we'd also expect over the course of the next 2 decades that, that the progress we make in energy production and the progress we make in these biotechnologies will produce new tools through which we can sequester carbon at very low cost. And so we'd expect the cost of sequestering carbon to drop dramatically. I'm not going to go into the energy disruption that we talk about now, but we see a very low cost and a sort of superabundance of energy as we move to an energy system based on solar, wind, and batteries. And harnessing that will allow us to sequester carbon at an extremely low cost. That's often the thing that adds cost to efforts to sequester. So it's hugely exciting across kind of every dimension environmentally. But also we'll see extremely low cost food. We'll see extremely secure food supplies, right? Our food supply chains will be localized. We'll be producing we're producing all the food we require much more locally. And we'll see a much more resilient system, as distributed systems tend to be. So in all kinds of different dimensions, this is extremely promising, socially, environmentally, economically.
Jamie, this is just awesome. And we look forward to having you. By the way, I think in your report, you said the amount of land that will be repurposed by reducing the livestock use of grazing is equal to the full size of the United States plus China plus another country.
Australia.
Plus Australia. So US, China, Australia, take all that land area and let the green grow through there. And we have all these kinds of fascinating implications. That is spot on with our discussion. We're so glad to have you there. A couple questions for you. Because of the controversy, I'm sure, what sort of reaction have you had from the food industry? And also, what kind of evidence supports your view that the speed of innovation is always underestimated? What do we see now? I mean, what, besides obviously like Impossible Foods, are there really new developments that you say that give you even more encouragement that what you said 3 years ago is coming true?
Yeah, thanks, Dean. So first of all, the reaction. I mean, I think there's been like all our reports, they're very divisive. We get some people who are hugely enthusiastic and supportive. We get others who are less enthusiastic, let's say, and resist and challenge. We are we're an independent think tank. We're a not-for-profit. Our aim is to get to the truth. I mean, we want to forewarn society about what's coming. right? Because, you know, there are other social implications when disruptions happen, right? You see livelihoods destroyed when industries are wiped out. You see communities destroyed. So, you know, we're not hung up on our research. We're trying to get towards the truth. So we welcome debate. But largely, you know, the thesis has held up, and you know, it's been in certain areas, often where there's a, you know, another motive or another perspective where the resistance has come from, or the disagreements have come. But, you know, we're happy to debate, and we're always open to discussion and to improving our work. I mean, that's what we want to do. Where we've got things wrong, you know, we're happy to admit it, and we'll update our models and our analysis. In terms of the progress since we published that report 3 years ago, I mean, it's been astounding. I mean, we've seen the cost curve is the kind of primary driver in many ways, and we've seen the improvements in cost continue to improve. I mean, we're you know, I think when we published, we were seeing, you know, prices for, you know, a kilogram of protein produced through precision fermentation at somewhere like $100 per kilo. And we're seeing prices well below that now, down well below $50 actually. And so that cost curve is continuing to go down, and we'd expect it. And you get kind of to cost competitive with bulk proteins at about $10 per kilo. So we're not that far away from that. We expect that by the kind of the middle of this decade. But also we're seeing improvements in structure, in the ability to structure more complex products. You know, as I mentioned, we have to kind of build up these products now from the single molecule or the cell. And some of the, you know, we thought that might be one of the hardest challenges, and it would be towards the end of this decade where we really saw solutions beginning to come through. But actually we're seeing some great progress in those dimensions as well. So, you know, in a number of ways we're seeing we're seeing improvement. I mean, there are still challenges, don't get me wrong, and there are still uncertainties, you know, about the eventual outcome, but everything seems to be moving in the direction you'd expect. And you always expect problems, and you always expect us to overcome problems as we develop technological knowledge. It's never a simple process, right? But it's you know, everything seems to be moving in the right direction.
Very good. Great, Jamie. Thank you for joining us today. And everybody who's listening, you can go read the RethinkX report, the 3-year-old report, and how they tie it together with energy and transportation that just came out last year. But you definitely want to come to the AGS conference and hear the latest updates from Jamie. Jamie, thanks again for making the trip over from London in November, and we really look forward to seeing you and talking with you at AGS Geography 2050, Columbia University in November. Thank you so much.
Pleasure, Dean. Bye-bye.
Bye.